Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first lecture on the French Revolution. I'm Dr. Petri, your world history teacher, and today we're going to start a series of several short lectures, no longer than 15 minutes, on the French Revolution, which will help you get better at taking notes, get better at listening, and hopefully, if you've read the book, or if you're reading the chapters in the book and taking the quizzes, will help you focus on what you need to study, what you should know, and better prepare you for the quizzes. So, the French Revolution. Between 1789 and 1799, France underwent a violent revolution that overthrew the French monarchy. It established a republican form of government with a constitution, which is a representative form of government. It degenerated into a period of terror and executions, or what they call mob rule, and then it ended with a military coup, or what they call a coup d'etat, where Napoleon came back and took over the country and took everybody's rights away again. So this revolution is considered to be one of the most controversial and significant events of the modern era. It brought to life in Europe the Enlightenment ideals of equality, freedom, and democracy, which would be the basis for reform movements and new political philosophies in the 19th century. So on we go to absolutism. And when we talk about absolutism, we're talking about absolute monarchs who do not share power or counsel, which is getting advice from a Congress. And this is King James the First of England, and King James is part of the Age of Absolutism. And this Age of Absolutism lasted from 1600 to 1800, and the monarchs in this time had complete authority. They did not share any of their power with a council or a cabinet. So absolutism is tied to the concept of the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs had been appointed by God and are responsible only to God, so then no one can question their judgment. How dare you? I speak to God. God talks to me and tells me what to do. So you, lousy peasant or petty noble person, cannot tell me what to do because only God does. So historians only usually identify James I of England as one of the first absolutist rulers. Not only did James believe that monarchs could have total power, this belief which led him to clash with the Parliament on several occasions, but he wrote extensively about the divine right of kings in his work, The True Law of Free Monarchies. He states that kings are called gods because they sit upon God, his throne in the earth, and have the count of their administration to give unto him. So King James, a big believer in giving more power to himself, not so much for the poor people. And that is bad for the poor people during the monarch movement, during this absolutism movement. But never fear, we're about to start sharing power. So under the absolute monarchs, we have a feudal system of land ownership, where everybody lives in this little area. They report to the king. They pay taxes to the king. We use peasant labor. Life for the peasants is very, very grim. Not much food. A lot of them starve. Disease. Lots of problems. So in the picture, you see a seigneurial grant here. And this is a noble person giving another knight who's swearing an oath of allegiance to them. By doing that, they get land. They get land from the king or from this noble in order to pledge to protect them. And this is how from the Middle Ages on, France and other European countries were structured in this feudalism system. And this was a system of land ownership and organization, also called manorialism. But most of the nobility in France owns land. And the term seigneur refers to the nobles who did own land. These seigneurs used peasant labor to work their lands, And in mid-18th century France, the nobility owned about 25% of the land, yet they paid very little in taxes. Under the seigneurial system, the nobles could tax the peasants who lived on their land. And this taxation of the peasants gives the seigneurs a major source of revenue. This is where they make most of their money, not from the actual farming, but from taxing the peasants who live on their land. And naturally, this is not greeted happily by the peasants, who are only allowed to eat what they grow. And then they have to give part of what they grow to the royals, to the nobles, for taxes. So this is King Louis XIV, and King Louis ruled from 1643 to 1715. He reduced the power of the nobility and gave it back to the king. He fought 4 huge wars, which greatly increased France's national debt. And before the French Revolution, France is called the Ancien Regime, the ancient regime. During this 130-year period, which spans both the 17th and the 18th centuries, so that's from 1600 to most of 1700, the country has 2 rulers. And the first is King Louis XIV. King Louis XIV had a powerful impact on France during his long reign, and he's considered by many as the epitome, the biggest example of an absolutist ruler. He centralized power in himself at the expense of the nobility. He removed them from their positions as governors and ministers, and he sort of downgraded them to this role of courtiers, just kind of like court gestures, just kind of people to hang out with at the palace, which is in Versailles. So Louis implemented these policies that led France to emerge as the dominant power in continental Europe. He increased the nation's standing army, and he fought 4 wars between 1667 and 1713. These wars added to France's international standing and prestige, but left the country deeply in debt. Louis increased this debt by undertaking both public constructions projects like new roads, new canals, and royal building projects, which were like the big palace, the Grand Palace at Versailles. He also spent huge sums of money maintaining a lavish lifestyle for the royal court at Versailles, and he attempted to offset France's mounting deficits by increasing taxes on the peasants. But by the time of his death, the country was heavily in debt. So, King Louis, absolutist power, takes power, fights 4 wars, increases the amount of debt France has as a nation. Where's he going to get that money? From the poor people. So, next we have the 7 Years' War. This is a war that is fought in both Europe, India, and North America. Let me put up these other slides here. Okay. In the United States, we call this the French and Indian War. But in France, they call it the 7 Years' War because that's how long it took to fight it. This is King Louis XV, and in the picture you see French and English troops fighting the Battle of Fort St. Philip, which is the island of Minorca, which I believe is off the coast of Africa. Or it might be Spain. I'd have to look at the map. But Louis XV, fights these wars, and France ends up losing a bunch of their colonial possessions, a bunch of their land, especially in the United States. So Louis XV, who ruled from 1715 to 1774, proved to be incapable of dealing with France's financial problems, and he increases the debt by involving France in the 7 Years' War. This war is the British and the Germans on one side against the French, although the Germans at this time were called Prussians, and then the Austrians and the Russians on the other. So the French have 4 enemies: the French, the Prussians, the Austrians, and the Russians. The fighting took place not just in Europe, but also in India and in North America. And France allied with the Native Americans against the British and the American colonists. And the war wound up being a stalemate or a tie in Europe, but France defeated quite a bit. They suffered a lot of defeats to the British in North America and also the British in India, and as a result, they were forced to give up some of their colonial possessions. And much of the burden of paying for this war falls again on the peasants, not the nobles, not the royals, but the poorest people in France. So, as you can tell, income inequality is a big thing here, and the poor people in France are starting to feel like they don't get what they pay for. So, the next slide talks about the three estates. This is the class system in France. And if you were part of the first estate, you were clergy or church officials, right? Each estate has specific roles and privileges. The first estate is the church, the second estate is the nobility or the aristocracy, and the third estate is most of the rest of France, the peasants and the common people. The third estate, which was the poorest group, provides most of the nation's taxes. Tax dollars are used to pay for wars, to pay for the king's palaces, and to support the wealthy lifestyle of the aristocracy, and to pay for other public projects. So France's first attempt at a parliament is called the Estates General, and the Estates General is established in 1602, and although it had once served a key role, by the 17th century its importance is totally declined, totally diminished. It's not very important. In fact, there was a huge length of time from 1614 until 1789 where the Estates General didn't even meet, right? So France is run by a king. They do not have much of a Congress or Parliament or the Estates General. That body has very little power. So next, our last, well, for a second, I guess I want to have you look at this cartoon, and I want you to tell me what the various figures represent and what message you think the artist is trying to convey. So which one is the first estate, which one is the second state, and which one is the third state? And it should be very clear to you that the king is down here riding who? Who's the guy in chains and blindfolded? That's the peasants. That's the third estate. And then who is riding on top of the king? That's the first estate. That's the clergy. And then the nobles are the second stage. And the nobles are pictured both by the king and by the guy in the top right, to the right of the clergyman. So the three estates, important to understand. The big takeaway is that the third estate was most of society, and the third estate paid all of the taxes to keep the first estate and the second estate living in luxury. And what happens is when people realize things aren't equal, wait a second, these guys are living in palaces and having fabulous meals, and I'm starving, and I'm lucky if I have 2 hunks of bread to give to my family. So because of this economic inequality, which is not allowed in the Declaration of Independence, the third estate is growing madder and more dissatisfied. So that concludes our first lecture. I will be back tomorrow with another lecture, but I hope you enjoyed this short sojourn through the first part of the French Revolution. Make sure you've taken notes, you've reviewed those notes, and we will see you tomorrow in class.